I had just thanked my grandfather for the $300 check when he froze, his knife hovering over the roast turkey. He looked at me like a stranger and spoke with terrifying clarity. He told me he had wired me $700,000. My sister's wine glass shattered against the white tablecloth like a sharp confession. As my family scrambled to call him senile, the cold truth hit me. I was not just being robbed, I was being framed. My name is Kendall Graham, and the first sign that my family had erased me from their reality was the security guard at the gate. It was raining, a cold, miserable drizzle that seemed unique to late November in North Carolina. I rolled down the window of my 2008 Honda Civic, bracing myself against the chill. The wiper blades were screeching against the glass, a rhythmic shriek that grated on my nerves. The guard was new. He looked impeccable in his uniform, standing under the heated shelter of the gatehouse that guarded the Crescent Bluff estates. He looked down at my car with the sort of polite disdain reserved for delivery drivers who had lost their way. I stated my name, Kendall Graham. He frowned, checking his clipboard. He told me I was not on the list. I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks, a mix of humiliation and exhaustion. I told him I was Earl Graham's granddaughter. I told him my mother, Celeste, was inside. He hesitated, then picked up the phone. I watched him murmur something, nod, and finally hit the button to open the wrought iron gates. As I drove through, I saw him make a note on his log. I was a guest, an uninvited one. Apparently, the driveway to the Graham estate was 1/4 of a mile long, lined with ancient oaks that my grandfather had paid a fortune to preserve when he built this place 30 years ago. The house itself loomed ahead, a Georgian revival mansion that looked more like a museum than a home. Every window was glowing with warm, golden light, promising a Thanksgiving of warmth and abundance. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text from my mother. "Park behind the equipment shed. The driveway is full." I looked at the driveway. It was empty, save for my father's Range Rover. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. It was not full. She just did not want my dented, rusting sedan sitting next to the pristine landscape architecture. She did not want the neighbors to see that one of the Grahams was driving a car that was worth less than their handbag. I drove around the back, navigating the mud near the shed where the landscaping crew kept their riding mowers. I parked next to a pile of mulch bags. I took a deep breath, checking my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired. Teaching 30 kindergartners how to hold a violin bow at Marigold Ridge Arts Magnet was rewarding. But it aged you. I applied a fresh coat of lipstick, trying to look like I belonged, and stepped out into the rain. By the time I reached the back entrance, soaking my boots in a puddle I had failed to see in the dark, the front of the house was alive with commotion. I walked through the kitchen, dodging the catering staff my mother had hired, so she would not have to lift a finger. The air smelled of sage and roasted poultry. I made my way to the foyer just in time to see the main event. The heavy front doors swung open, and there they were, Brielle and Gavin. My sister looked like she had just stepped out of a filtered Instagram reel. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, her blonde hair falling in perfect, glossy waves. Hanging off her arm was Gavin, her husband of 2 years. Gavin worked in high finance, or at least that was what he told everyone. He was wearing a suit that fit him a little too tightly, designed to show off his gym hours. My mother, Celeste, rushed forward, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She embraced Brielle as if she were a returning war hero. She gushed about how radiant Brielle looked. She told Gavin he looked like a titan of industry. My father, Randall, emerged from the den, drink in hand, and actually smiled. He shook Gavin's hand with a vigor he never showed anyone else. I stood by the entrance to the dining room, dripping slightly onto the rug. No one looked at me. It was a fascinating display of hierarchy. Brielle and Gavin were the success stories, the glossy print advertisements for the Graham family legacy. I was the typo they were trying to ignore. Finally, my mother turned. Her smile tightened by a fraction of an inch. She told me I was late. She told me to go dry off before I ruined the hardwood. I went to the powder room, dried my hair with a hand towel that was softer than my bedsheets, and stared at myself. I had to get through 4 hours. Just 4 hours. I needed to thank Grandpa Earl for the check he had sent me last week. That was the only reason I had come. That $300 had paid my electric bill and kept my landlord off my back for another week. I needed to show him gratitude. When I returned, everyone was seated at the long mahogany table. The centerpiece was a sprawling arrangement of autumn leaves and exotic orchids that must have cost a fortune. I took the empty seat at the far end, opposite my father. Dinner was a theater production. Gavin held court, talking loudly about a merger he was overseeing. He threw around buzzwords like synergy and leverage. He talked about liquidity events and market caps. I watched him as he spoke. He was animated, almost too animated. He kept touching his tie, tapping his water glass, shifting in his chair. Brielle sat next to him, occasionally holding up her hand to catch the light on her diamond ring. She was live streaming parts of the dinner, holding her phone up to capture the spread, the crystal glasses, the illusion of old money perfection. She narrated in that breathless, whispery voice she used for her followers. She talked about tradition and blessings. Then, the attention shifted to me. Gavin looked down the table, a smirk playing on his lips. He asked how the little flute players were doing. He asked if I had managed to teach them to play anything that did not sound like a dying cat yet. My mother let out a short, sharp laugh. She took a sip of her wine and said that at least I was keeping busy. She said it was a cute hobby, teaching at that public school. I felt the familiar sting. I told them it was not a hobby. I told them that Marigold Ridge was an arts magnet school for underprivileged kids. I told them we had a concert coming up in December. Brielle rolled her eyes, not looking up from her phone. She said nobody cared about public school concerts. She said I should have taken the internship Gavin offered me 2 years ago. She said I could have been making real money instead of playing saint. I gripped my fork. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them that I was the only one doing something real, but I stayed silent. I was used to this. The only person who had not spoken was my grandfather, Earl. He sat at the head of the table, a massive figure even at 78 years old. He had built the Graham construction empire from a single pickup truck and a shovel. He had calloused hands and a mind like a steel trap. Though lately, the family had been whispering that he was slipping, that he was forgetting things. He looked up from his plate, his blue eyes sharp and clear. He ignored Gavin. He ignored Brielle. He looked straight at me. He asked me about the scholarship program I was trying to start. He asked if the instruments I had ordered had arrived yet. I felt a lump form in my throat. He remembered. I had told him about the program months ago, in passing. I didn't think he had been listening. I told him we were still short on funding, but the kids were practicing on the old rentals. I told him about a student named Marcus who had perfect pitch but no violin of his own. Earl nodded slowly. He said that was good work. He said work that built something was the only work that mattered. The table went silent. Gavin's smile faltered. My mother looked annoyed that the conversation had shifted away from the golden couple. I decided this was the moment. I wanted to show him I appreciated his support, no matter how small. I reached into my purse, which I had tucked under my chair, and pulled out the envelope. I had already deposited the check via the mobile app, but I had kept the physical copy to write a thank you note on the back, intending to give it to him personally. I cleared my throat. My hands were shaking slightly. I said, "Grandpa, I wanted to say thank you." I held up the check. It was a standard personal check, filled out in his shaky, distinct handwriting. I said the $300 really helped me out this month. I told him it covered the heating bill and the rest went to groceries. I said I appreciated him thinking of me. For a second, there was silence. Then, Brielle snorted. She covered her mouth with a manicured hand. Laughing, she asked if I was serious. She asked if I was really bringing up a $300 check at the Thanksgiving table. She said it was pathetic. My mother sighed, shaking her head. She told me to put it away. She said I shouldn't make things difficult or look so desperate. She said it was embarrassing to talk about such small sums when Gavin was discussing millions. I felt my face burn. I started to lower the check, feeling like a fool. I had just wanted to say thank you. I had just wanted to acknowledge his kindness, but Earl was not laughing. He had been in the middle of carving the turkey. He was holding the heavy silver carving knife in his right hand and a large fork in his left. He stopped. He went completely still. He lowered the knife slowly to the platter. The metal made a dull clink against the china. He turned his head. He looked at me. But it wasn't the warm look from a moment ago. It was a look of absolute confusion, followed immediately by a terrifying, sharp clarity. It was the look of a man who sees a structural crack in a building everyone else thinks is sound. He asked me to repeat that. I stammered. I said, "The check, the $300. Earl stared at me. He spoke very slowly, very clearly. His voice was not the voice of a senile old man. It was the voice of the man who had negotiated contracts with unions and city councils for 50 years. He said, $300. He leaned forward, his knuckles white on the tablecloth. He told me he had wired me $700,000. The air left the room. It didn't just go quiet. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on everyone's chest, I froze. I looked at him, trying to process the number. 700,000. It was a number that didn't make sense in my world. My mother started to laugh. A nervous, high-pitched sound. She said, "Oh, Dad, you are confused again." She looked at Gavin. She said Grandpa was having one of his episodes, but then, it happened. Brielle, who had been swirling her red wine in her oversized crystal glass, looking bored, went rigid. Her hand spasmed. The glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the edge of her plate and shattered. The sound was explosive in the silent room. Red wine splashed across the pristine white tablecloth, soaking into the fabric like an arterial spray. It dripped down the side of the table, pooling on the expensive rug. Brielle did not move to clean it up. She did not gasp. She sat frozen, her face draining of all color, her eyes wide and terrified. She looked at Gavin. I looked at Gavin too. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face had gone blank, a mask of calculation. He was staring at Earl with a look that wasn't concern for an elderly relative. It was the look of a predator realizing the cage door was unlocked. Earl ignored the shattered glass. He ignored my mother's frantic attempts to signal the maid. He kept his eyes locked on mine. He repeated it. He said he had authorized the transfer on Tuesday. $700,000. To my account. To help with the house. To help with the school. I sat there, the $300 check trembling in my hand. I looked at the wine spreading on the table. I looked at Brielle's terror. I looked at Gavin's cold eyes. And finally, I looked at my mother, who was glaring at me as if I had caused the glass to break, as if I had caused Earl's confusion. But he wasn't confused. The pieces slammed together in my mind with the force of a car crash. Earl had sent $700,000. I had received $300. There was a gap of $699,700. Where did it go? And then, a colder thought washed over me, chilling me deeper than the rain outside ever could. If Earl had sent that money to me, and it was gone, then on paper. I was the one who had received it. To the IRS, to the bank, to the world. I was the one with nearly $750,000. If that money was missing, I wasn't just a victim of theft. I looked at Gavin again. He was slowly reaching for his phone, sliding it under the table. They weren't just stealing from Earl. They were using my name to do it. I wasn't just being robbed. I was being set up as the thief, the black sheep, the desperate teacher with the debt and the old car, the perfect scapegoat. I lowered the check to the table. I didn't say a word. I just watched the wine stain grow, spreading out like a confession that no one was willing to speak. Growing up in the shadow of the Graham dynasty, I learned very early on that there are two types of currency in our family. There is actual money, which my grandfather earned with sweat and concrete. And then there is attention, which my sister Brielle hoarded like a dragon sitting on gold. I was the rough draft, the practice run before my parents figured out how to manufacture perfection. Brielle was the final print, glossy and retouched, designed specifically for public consumption. My mother, Celeste, never said it outright, but the inventory of our lives was clear. Brielle was the asset. I was the liability. When Brielle wanted to go to a private design institute in Milan, the check was written before she packed her bags. When I wanted to study music education, I was given a lecture on the return on investment and a brochure for student loans. I did not resent it at the time. I convinced myself that independence was a noble trade-off for luxury. I worked double shifts at a coffee shop to pay for my textbooks. I drove a car that rattled when it went over 40 miles per hour. I lived in a studio apartment where the radiator clanked like a dying engine. I paid my own way, and in return, I thought I had earned the right to be respected as an adult. I was wrong. In the Graham household, needing nothing did not make you strong. It made you invisible. And needing a little help, like that $300 for my electricity, made you repulsive. It was not just the money, it was the aesthetic. My mother treated her life like a magazine spread where nothing was allowed to be out of place. Earlier that afternoon, before the dinner disaster, I had walked into the kitchen carrying a pecan pie I had baked from scratch. I had spent 4 hours shelling nuts and making the crust, thinking it would be a nice gesture, something warm and real. My mother had looked at the aluminum tin as if I had brought a dead animal into the house. She whisked it away, hiding it in the back of the pantry behind the oversized boxes of gourmet crackers, whispering that the caterers had already provided a tart and we did not want to clutter the dessert table. My homemade effort was an eyesore. It did not fit the brand. Brielle, on the other hand, was the brand. She did not have a job in the traditional sense. She had a platform. She had followers. She had sponsors who sent her boxes of skincare products and vitamins that she promoted with wide smiles and rehearsed captions. Her entire existence was a performance of ease, but I knew the cracks in the foundation. I knew that the lease on her luxury SUV was co-signed by our father. I knew that the vacation photos she posted were often from trips paid for by brand partnerships that barely covered the airfare, leaving mom and dad to pick up the 5-star hotel tab. And then there was Gavin. My brother-in-law was a man constructed entirely out of buzzwords and confidence. He liked to corner people at parties and talk about wealth management vehicles and tax mitigation strategies. He used words like arbitrage and liquidity as if they were punctuation marks. But I had noticed something over the last year. He never talked about specifics. He never mentioned a specific client, a specific project, or a specific win. It was always abstract. He was always on the verge of closing something massive, always one meeting away from a windfall. He talked loud to cover the silence where his actual achievements should have been. He wore expensive watches, but I had seen him check his banking app once when he thought no one was looking, and the grimace on his face was not the expression of a man flush with cash. Grandpa Earl was the only one who saw through the fog. He was a man who understood the weight of a dollar because he had lifted the bricks to earn it. He did not care about brand partnerships or liquidity events. He cared about foundations. He cared about things that stood up when the wind blew. That was why he and I had a quiet, unspoken understanding. He knew I was the only one in the family who knew how to balance a checkbook without asking for a bailout. He knew I was teaching kids who had nothing, trying to give them something beautiful in a world that was often ugly. That was why he sent the money to me. He did not send $700,000 to Brielle, who would have spent it on a lifestyle she could not sustain. He did not send it to my mother, who would have used it to renovate a kitchen that was already perfect. He sent it to me. He trusted me to steward it. And that was why the scene at the dinner table was so terrifying. When Earl dropped that number $700,000, I saw something happen to Brielle that went beyond shock. I saw her hands spasm and the wine glass fall. Yes, but in the chaos that followed, while the maid was rushing in with towels and my mother was screeching about the carpet, I saw Brielle's hands move under the table. She was not wringing them in despair. She was typing. It was a rapid, frantic movement of her thumbs against the screen of her phone, her eyes darting around the room to see if anyone was watching. She was not texting a friend for comfort. You do not text a friend with that kind of laser-focused intensity when your grandfather has just accused you of grand larceny. You text an accomplice. You text a cleaner. She looked up, caught my eye, and for a split second, the mask slipped. There was no sisterly concern there. There was no confusion. There was a hard, cold hatred. It was the look of someone who had been caught, not by the police, but by the one person she considered too stupid to figure it out. Then the wall went back up. My mother descended on me. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask Earl for clarification. She went into damage control mode. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my bicep with surprising strength. She hissed that I had upset him. She said I knew his mind was fragile. She said I had come here with my sob story about $300 and confused him into thinking he had given me a fortune. She twisted the narrative instantly. In her version of reality, I was the villain who had triggered a senile episode in a helpless old man. I looked at my father, Randall. He was standing by the sideboard, pouring himself another scotch. He heard every word. He saw his wife manhandling his daughter. He saw the panic in Gavin's eyes and the malice in Brielle's, and he did nothing. He just swirled the amber liquid in his glass and looked at the painting of a fox hunt on the wall. He was a ghost in his own house, bought and paid for by his wife's ambition and his father's money, completely unwilling to rock the boat. My mother practically dragged me to the back door. She told me to leave. She said I was toxic. She said I was ruining the holiday. I did not fight her. I was too stunned by the sheer scale of the betrayal. I walked out into the rain, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind me with a finality that felt like a sentence. I sat in my car for a long time. The engine was cold. The rain drummed against the roof, a relentless, drowning sound. I stared at the lit windows of the mansion. Inside, they were probably toasting to my departure. They were probably calming Earl down, telling him it was all a mix-up, telling him that Kendall was confused, that Kendall was struggling, that they would handle it. They were rewriting history while the ink was still wet. I looked at the check for $300 sitting on my passenger seat. It looked ridiculous now. A scrap of paper, a joke, but the $700,000 was not a joke. If Gavin and Brielle had engineered this, they had done something very specific. They had not just stolen the money, They had routed it through me. They had created a paper trail that led directly to my door. If I went to the police now, without proof, without understanding the mechanism of the theft, I would be walking into a trap. Gavin would have the paperwork ready. He would have the digital footprints. He would paint me as the desperate, poor music teacher who took advantage of her grandfather's dementia to embezzle a fortune. My mother would back them up. Not because she hated me, perhaps, but because protecting Brielle and Gavin meant protecting the image of the family. I was expendable. I was the rough draft. The realization hardened something inside me. It felt like a steel rod being inserted into my spine. I was done being the polite one. I was done being the one who accepted the crumbs and said thank you. I was done being the one who parked behind the shed. They thought they were dealing with the Kendall who baked pies and taught kindergartners how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. They forgot that I was also the granddaughter of Earl Graham. They forgot that I had his blood running through my veins, the blood of a man who cleared forests and moved mountains. I picked up my phone. My hands were not shaking anymore. I dialed the landline in Earl's study. I knew he often retreated there when the noise of the family became too much. I prayed he was there now. It rang 4 times. Then, a click, a gruff voice said hello. It was him. He sounded tired, but he did not sound confused. I spoke clearly, keeping my voice low and steady, matching the rhythm of the rain. I said, "Grandpa, do not say my name. Just listen." I told him I knew he was not crazy. I told him I knew he sent the money. I told him that I did not receive it, but I knew who did. There was a pause on the line. Then he asked, simply, "What do we do?" I told him to be ready at 9 o'clock the next morning. I told him I would pick him up at the end of the driveway, away from the house cameras. I told him to bring his identification and his personal ledger. I said, "Tomorrow, we are going to the bank. We are going to pull the records. We are going to drag the truth out into the light. No matter whose name is attached to it," he said, "I will be there." He hung up. I started my car. The engine sputtered and then roared to life. I did not look back at the house as I drove down the long, dark driveway. I was not leaving in shame this time. I was leaving to sharpen my knife. They wanted a villain, fine. I would be the villain who tore their perfect little paper castle down to the ground. The morning sun did not feel like a new beginning. It felt like an interrogation lamp. I pulled my Honda up to the curb at exactly 9 o'clock, just past the stone pillars of the Graham Estate's service entrance. Earl was already there. He was wearing his charcoal Sunday suit and a fedora that he had not worn since my grandmother's funeral. He looked small against the backdrop of the massive hedges, but as he opened the car door and slid into the passenger seat, the air in the car changed. He did not smell like old age or lavender anymore. He smelled like aftershave and purpose. We did not speak much on the drive to the bank. The silence was heavy, filled with the things we were both afraid to find. I focused on the road, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. We were heading to the main branch of First Piedmont, the financial fortress where my grandfather had kept his accounts since the 70s. It was a place of mahogany desks, hushed voices, and the kind of carpet that swallowed the sound of footsteps. When we walked in, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The tellers looked up, their smiles bright and practiced, but faltered when they saw who I was with. Earl walked with a cane now, but he used it less for support, and more like a weapon he was keeping in reserve. We bypassed the line and went straight to the glass-walled office at the back. Mr. Sterling, the branch manager, looked up from his computer. He was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that produced generic banking executives. He had a perfect part in his hair and a tie that matched his pocket square. When he saw Earl, he stood up too quickly, knocking a pen off his desk. He welcomed us with a nervous energy that set my teeth on edge. He offered coffee. He offered water. He asked how the holiday was. He did everything except ask us why we were there. Earl sat down slowly, resting his hands on the head of his cane. He told Sterling to cut the pleasantries. He said we needed to see the transaction history for his primary holding account, specifically, a transfer of $700,000 made on Tuesday. Sterling froze. His eyes darted to me, then back to Earl. He cleared his throat. He said that for transactions of that size, he usually coordinated with Gavin. He said Gavin was the designated family liaison for the trust accounts. He reached for the phone. He said he should probably get Gavin on the line to make sure everyone was on the same page. I felt a cold spike of adrenaline. This was the wall. Gavin had built a perimeter around Earl, using protection as a guise for control. If Sterling called Gavin, the game was over. Gavin would spin a story. Or worse, he would show up. I opened my mouth to argue, But Earl got there first. He did not raise his voice. He did not shout. He simply leaned forward, and for a moment, the 78-year-old man vanished, replaced by the foreman who used to fire men twice his size for cutting corners. He asked Sterling whose name was on the account. He asked whose money built this bank branch back in 1982. He asked if Sterling wanted to remain employed by the time the lunch hour rolled around. Earl said he did not give a damn about protocols involving his granddaughter's husband. He said he wanted the trace, and he wanted it now. Sterling slowly lowered his hand from the phone. He looked at Earl, and he saw something that terrified him. He nodded. He sat back down and began to type. The clicking of the keyboard was the only sound in the room. It sounded like a ticking clock. After 2 agonizing minutes, the printer in the corner whirred to life. Sterling stood up, retrieved a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the polished mahogany desk. He said the transfer was cleared and completed. He said the funds had been moved to a business account. I looked at the paper. My breath hitched in my throat. The recipient listed was not a shell company in the Cayman Islands. It was not a numbered account. It read, Kendall Graham Arts LLC. I stared at the words, willing them to change. The room seemed to tilt. I looked at Earl. His face was unreadable. I whispered that I did not have an LLC. I said I had never registered a business in my life. Sterling looked at me with a mixture of pity and skepticism. He pulled a file from a drawer. He said that the bank had received the articles of incorporation and the account opening documents digitally 3 weeks ago. He slid a second piece of paper toward me. It was a signature card, and there, at the bottom, in blue ink, was my signature. It was not a forgery that looked kinda like mine. It was my signature. The loop of the K, the sharp angle of the G, the way I trailed off at the end. It was perfect. It was so perfect that for a second, I questioned my own sanity. Had I done this? Had I blacked out and opened a company? No. That was impossible. I looked closer. The pressure of the ink was uniform. There were no variations in line weight. It wasn't written. It was traced, or copied. I told them this was not real. I told them someone had copied my signature. Sterling sighed. He said he understood this was a difficult situation. He said that often, in families with complex finances, things could get confused. He was giving me an out. He was offering me the misunderstanding narrative, but his eyes were cold. He believed the paper. Earl spoke up. He asked where the bank account for this LLC was located. Sterling adjusted his glasses. He said it was a digital fintech bank. He said they had no physical branches. He said all he could see was the routing number and the legal entity name. He said once the money left First Piedmont, it was out of his jurisdiction. I felt sick. A digital bank, an LLC in my name, a signature that looked real. Then Earl said something that made the blood drain from my face completely. He said he remembered the day he made the transfer. He said he had been in his study. He said his cataracts were bad that day, and the screen was blurry. He said Brielle had come in to bring him tea. He said he had asked her to help him type in the account number I had supposedly sent him. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terrible realization. He said Brielle held the phone. He said she read the numbers out loud as she typed them. I closed my eyes. It wasn't just a theft. It was a masterpiece of framing. Brielle had not just stolen the money. She had created a destination that looked exactly like me. She had likely lifted my signature from a birthday card, or one of the many documents I had signed for the family over the years. She had opened an online bank account in my name, which is terrifyingly easy to do if you have someone's social security number and a copy of their ID. And my mother kept all our vital documents in the safe in the library. Brielle had access to everything. If the police looked at this right now, they would not see a victim. They would see a struggling schoolteacher who created a shell company, forged a reason for a transfer, and convinced her senile grandfather to sign off on it. I looked at Sterling. I asked for the address. I asked where Kendall Graham Arts LLC was registered. Sterling hesitated, then pointed to a line on the incorporation document. It was not my apartment address. It was not the school. It was Box 404. The Parcel Concierge, 112 Crescent Boulevard. I knew the place. It was a high-end shipping and mail center in the middle of the most expensive shopping district in Crescent Bluff. It was the kind of place where people with too much money sent their packages so they did not have to deal with the common mail carriers. Earl grabbed his cane. He said we were going to the police station. He said we were going to file a fraud report immediately. I put my hand on his arm. I pressed down firmly. I said no. Earl looked at me, shocked. He asked why the hell not. I lowered my voice, leaning in so Sterling could not hear every word, though I knew he was listening. I told Earl that if we went to the police now, With only this paper, Gavin would spin it. I told him Gavin would say, I set the whole thing up and was now trying to cover my tracks because I got caught. I told him the evidence pointed to me, not them. I told him that my signature was on that card. I told him the money went to a company with my name. I said we did not have a smoking gun yet. We had a mirror that was reflecting my own face back at me. If I went to the authorities now, I would be handing Gavin the shovel to bury me. I stood up. I took the papers from the desk. I folded them neatly and put them in my purse. I thanked Mr. Sterling for his time. I told him we would handle this internally for now. Sterling looked relieved. He did not want a scandal. He just wanted us gone. We walked out of the bank into the gray daylight. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick and cold. Earl leaned against the car. He looked older than he had an hour ago. He asked me what we were going to do if we were not going to the police. I looked at the address on the paper again. Box 404. I told him that an LLC is just a piece of paper. I said a bank account is just numbers. But someone had to physically go to that box. Someone had to pick up the mail. Someone had to be the face of the operation. Brielle was lazy. She wouldn't drive to a sketchy part of town. That was why she picked the parcel concierge. It was convenient. It was near her favorite boutiques. I told Earl that we were going to find out who was opening box 404. I said I needed to drop him off at home. I said he needed to act normal. I said he needed to pretend that the trip to the bank was just a confused old man checking his balance and forgetting what he saw. He straightened up. The fierce light was back in his eyes. He said he could play the part. He said he had been playing the part of the silent observer for years. I got into the driver's seat. The fear was still there, churning in my stomach. But it was being overtaken by something else. A hunter's instinct. They had used my name. They had used my identity. They thought I was just a music teacher who played by the rules. I put the car in gear. I was going to the parcel concierge. I was not going to ask for the manager. I was going to wait. And I was going to see which one of my loving family members came to collect the rewards of their betrayal. The gap between $300 and $700,000 was about to get a lot smaller. The parcel concierge was not a post office. It was a sanctuary for people who considered standing in line to be a human rights violation. Located in the heart of the Crescent Bluff shopping district, it sat nestled between a boutique that sold artisan olive oil and a jeweler who required an appointment just to look at the window display. I pulled my Honda Civic into the lot, parking it conspicuously between a white G-Wagon and a sleek, black electric sedan that cost more than my entire education. I saw a woman in oversized sunglasses glance at my rusting wheel well with visible distaste as she loaded a stack of professionally wrapped boxes into her trunk. I did not care. I was not here to fit in. I was here to hunt. I smoothed down my coat. It was a practical wool blend I had bought on sale 3 years ago. A stark contrast to the cashmere and silk that usually paraded through these doors. I took a breath, holding the image of my grandfather's confused, terrified face in my mind. That anger was my fuel. It burned hotter than the shame of being the poor relation. The interior of the shop smelled of lavender and expensive cardstock. The floors were polished concrete, and the lighting was designed to make everyone look 10 years younger. Behind the counter, a wall of brass mailboxes gleamed under the track lighting. There was one employee working the front desk. He was young, maybe 22, with a shock of curly hair and a name tag that read, Caleb. He was currently trying to explain to a woman in a tennis skirt why he could not ship a bottle of wine to a state where it was illegal. I stood back and waited. I watched the customers. They moved with a specific kind of entitlement, the body language of people who believe the world is staffed for their convenience. I wondered if Brielle looked like that when she came here. I wondered if she floated in, smelling of vanilla and arrogance, demanding her packages. When the tennis woman finally stormed out, Caleb let out a long, audible sigh and slumped against the counter. He looked up at me, his customer service smile already fading into exhaustion. But then he paused. He squinted. He asked if I was Ms. Graham, from Marigold Ridge. I blinked, taken aback. I looked closer at his face, the curly hair, the nervous energy. It clicked. I asked if he was Caleb, the cello player, class of 2018. A genuine smile broke across his face. He stood up straighter. He told me he was. He said he still remembered the pep talk I gave him before the district solo competition. He said he would have thrown up on his shoes if I had not sat with him in the hallway and breathed through the panic attack with him. I felt a sudden, sharp pang in my chest. This was my life. This was who I was. I was the teacher who sat in hallways. I was the one who cared. And my family had tried to twist that identity into something pathetic, something to be mocked at a dinner table. I smiled back at him. I told him I was glad to see him. I asked how he was doing. He told me he was working here while finishing his degree in graphic design. He said the pay was decent, even if the clientele was a nightmare. He leaned in, lowering his voice. He said people in this zip code were different. I nodded. I told him I knew exactly what he meant. I placed my hands on the counter. I decided to trust the connection. I decided to trust the version of myself that Caleb remembered, not the version my mother tried to create. I told him I needed a favor, a big one. Caleb looked at me, his expression serious. He asked what I needed. I told him I was looking for information on Box 404. His face changed instantly. The friendly nostalgia vanished, replaced by a look of visceral annoyance. He groaned. He asked if I knew the woman who rented that box. He said she was the absolute worst. He said she treated the staff like furniture. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I asked him to describe her. He shrugged. He said it was hard to say exactly what she looked like because she was always in incognito mode. Big hat, huge sunglasses, scarf wrapped around her face like she was a celebrity dodging the paparazzi. He said she never spoke much, just shoved her phone in his face with the pickup code and snapped her fingers if he moved too slow. I felt a cold thrill. It sounded like a caricature. It sounded exactly like Brielle trying to play a spy. I asked if he had security footage. Caleb hesitated. He looked at the camera in the corner of the ceiling. He said he wasn't really supposed to show customers the feed. It was against policy. I leaned in closer. I told him that my identity had been stolen. I told him that the person opening Box 404 was using my name to commit fraud against my grandfather. I did not lie. I gave him the raw truth because I respected him enough to handle it. Caleb's eyes went wide. He looked at the computer screen, then back at me. He remembered the teacher who had helped him. He remembered the kindness. He typed a password into his terminal. He said, "Screw policy." He said if it was that woman, he would help me nail her. He hated the way she made the new girl cry last week. He turned the monitor so I could see it. He scrolled back through the logs. He said she had been in yesterday, around 2 in the afternoon. He clicked a file. The video was high definition. A woman walked into the frame. She was wearing a trench coat that was belted tightly at the waist. She had a wide-brimmed black hat pulled low and sunglasses that covered half her face. To a stranger, she might have been anonymous, but I was not a stranger. I knew that walk. It was a specific, hip-leading stride, a mix of runway practice and impatience. I watched her approach the counter. I watched the way she tapped her fingernails on the glass while Caleb went to retrieve a package. It was a rhythmic tapping. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Brielle did that when she was agitated, but that was circumstantial. I needed more. Then, she turned slightly to check her reflection in the glass display case of the boutique next door, visible through the shop window. As she turned, the heavy tote bag on her shoulder swung into clear view. I froze the image. It was a vibrant, aggressive shade of chartreuse. It was a structured leather bag with gold hardware that looked like it weighed 5 pounds. I knew that bag. 3 days ago, Brielle had posted a story on her Instagram. She had been unboxing a special treat for herself. She had tagged the designer. She had called it the Electric Lime Edition. She had bragged that there were only 50 of them made in the entire country. I pointed at the screen. I asked Caleb if he could zoom in on the bag. He did. The color popped against the gray of the trench coat. I pulled out my phone. I opened Brielle's Instagram profile. I scrolled down to her highlights reel titled, Hauls. I found the video. I held my phone up next to the monitor. The bag on the screen and the bag on the phone were identical. Caleb whistled low. He said that was a match. I watched the rest of the clip. Caleb handed her 3 large boxes. She did not thank him. She did not make eye contact. She just pointed to the door, indicating he should help her carry them. I asked Caleb what was in those boxes. He checked the log. He said they were from a high-end electronics retailer and a luxury home goods store. He said the shipping labels were addressed to Kendall Graham Arts LLC. I felt a wave of nausea. She wasn't just stealing the money. She was shopping with it. She was buying flat-screen televisions and designer sheets and God knows what else, and she was funneling it all through a fake company that bore my name. Every time she signed for a package, she was cementing the lie. She was building a physical inventory of goods that, on paper, belonged to me. If the IRS came knocking, they would see that Kendall Graham Arts LLC had spent thousands of dollars on office equipment and staging materials. They would see the goods were picked up by a representative. They would see the money leaving Earl's account and entering mine. I thanked Caleb. I asked if I could get a copy of that clip. He pulled a flash drive from his drawer. He said he would do me one better. He downloaded the last 5 visits she had made. He said she came in about twice a week. I took the drive. It felt heavy in my hand. Heavier than the plastic it was made of. It was ammunition. I walked back out to my car. The rain starting to spit again. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the steering wheel. I had the who. It was Brielle. There was no doubt now, but as I watched the shoppers hurry past, a nagging thought took root in my mind. Brielle was greedy. She was vain. She was cruel. But she was not a detail person. Brielle could not file her own taxes. She once paid a service to organize her closet because she found it too overwhelming. The idea of her setting up an LLC, obtaining an employer identification number, opening a digital business bank account, and creating a layered paper trail. It did not fit. Brielle was the consumer. She was the one who wanted the bag and the camera time. She was the face of the operation. But the structure, the digital banking, the complex routing of funds that made it look like a legitimate business transfer that smelled like Gavin, who walked around parties talking about tax shelters. Gavin, who bragged about his knowledge of corporate structures. Gavin, who always made sure he was the one translating the financial jargon for the family. Brielle was the loot. Gavin was the heist. He was using her too. He was letting her take the risk, letting her walk into the store with the camera trained on her face, letting her carry the stolen goods. If things went south, Brielle was the one on the tape. Brielle was the one with the bag, and I was the one with the name. Gavin was nowhere to be found in the paperwork or the footage. He was clean. I realized then that I could not just walk into a family meeting and shout the truth. They would shred me. Gavin would talk circles around me with legal terms I did not understand. He would claim the LLC was identity theft by a stranger, and Brielle was just picking up packages she thought were gifts. He would find a loophole. I needed someone who knew how to dig through the dirt without getting dirty. I needed someone who could look at a digital footprint and see the person standing in the shadows. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in 2 years. Miles Red. Miles was a private investigator. Before that, he had been a forensic accountant for the state. He was a man who saw the world in spreadsheets and hidden assets. He also owed me, 2 years ago. His son, Leo, had wanted to quit music. Leo was on the spectrum and struggled with the noise and chaos of the regular band class. I had created a quiet, one-on-one curriculum for him during my lunch breaks. I had sat with him until he found his rhythm on the piano. Miles had cried at the winter recital when Leo played his solo. He had told me that if I ever needed anything at all, I should call. I pressed the call button. It rang twice. A deep, gravelly voice answered. He said hello. Kendall, I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I said, Miles, remember when you told me you were good at finding things that people wanted to keep hidden? He said he remembered. I said I need you to find $700,000, and I need you to find out why my brother-in-law, Gavin, is pretending to be a financial genius when I think he is actually a thief. There was a pause. I could hear the sound of a lighter clicking and a long exhale. Miles said, Tell me everything. Start from the turkey. I put the car in reverse. The hunt was expanding. I wasn't just looking for a thief anymore. I was looking for the architect of my destruction, and I was going to bring the blueprints down on his head. Miles Red's office was located in a strip mall that had seen better days, wedged between a dry cleaner and a dentist who offered discount whitening. It was not the kind of place where high-stakes corporate espionage usually unraveled, but Miles preferred it that way. He said it lowered people's expectations. I walked in on Tuesday evening, shaking the rain off my umbrella. Miles was sitting behind a desk buried under stacks of paper, the blue light of his monitors reflecting in his glasses. He looked up, and for the first time since I had known him, he did not smile. He looked worried. He gestured to the chair opposite him. He did not offer me tea or water. He simply pushed a thick manila folder across the desk. He told me I was not going to like what was in there. He said that if I thought I was dealing with a simple case of greed, I was wrong. He said I was dealing with a man who was drowning and trying to use my grandfather as a life raft. I opened the folder. The first photo was grainy, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed Gavin. He was not in a high-rise office downtown. He was sitting at a small, round table in a chain coffee shop about 5 miles from the Crescent Bluff estate. He was wearing his expensive suit, but his tie was loosened, and he was slumped over his laptop. Miles leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. He told me that for the last 3 days, that table was Gavin's office. He said Gavin arrived at 8:30 in the morning, bought a single medium latte, and sat there until 5. I looked closer at the photo. Gavin looked haggard. He was holding his phone, but he wasn't speaking. Miles explained that Gavin pretended to take calls. He said he watched him hold the phone to his ear and nod at empty air for 20 minutes at a time, just in case anyone was watching. He said it was a performance for an audience of 0. I felt a chill. The arrogance Gavin had displayed at Thanksgiving, the talk of mergers and acquisitions, the way he belittled my teaching job, it was all a costume. I asked Miles if Gavin had a job. Miles slid a single sheet of paper out from the bottom of the stack. It was a photocopy of a termination letter from a mid-sized investment firm in Charlotte. It was dated 4 months ago. He pointed to the second paragraph. The reason for termination was listed as compliance violations and unauthorized trading. Miles said Gavin didn't just lose his job. He said Gavin was blacklisted. He said no reputable firm would touch him with a 10-foot pole. He said Gavin had been unemployed since August. I stared at the date. August. That meant for the last 4 months. Gavin had been waking up, putting on a suit, kissing Brielle goodbye, and driving to a coffee shop to stare at a screen and pretend he still mattered. But being unemployed did not explain the need for $700,000. You could live on savings for a while. I turned the page. It was a credit report. Or rather, a disaster report. Miles ran a hand through his thinning hair. He said this was where it got ugly. He said Gavin had maxed out 4 premium credit cards. He had taken out a line of credit on his car, and then he had gone to the secondary market. I asked what he meant by secondary market. Miles said loan sharks. He said online predatory lenders with interest rates that should be illegal. I looked at the bank statements Miles had dug up. There were dozens of transactions to websites I didn't recognize. Royal Flush Digital, Bet Limitless, Vegas Direct. My stomach dropped. He wasn't trading stocks. He was gambling. Miles confirmed it. He said Gavin was bleeding money into online poker and sports betting sites. He said it looked like he was trying to win back his losses, chasing the dragon, doubling down every time he lost. It was the classic spiral of a desperate addict. I thought back to the dinner, Gavin's sweat, the way he tapped his glass, the manic energy. He wasn't excited about a deal. He was terrified. He was probably waiting for a bookie to call him, but then I thought of Brielle. Surely she knew. She was his wife. She saw the bills. I asked Miles about Brielle. Miles sighed. He flipped to the next section of the folder. He said Brielle was not innocent, but she was living in a fantasy world. He said her finances were a house of cards built on a swamp. He showed me a list of her recent purchases, the designer handbags, the couture dresses, the jewelry she flaunted on social media. Next to almost every item was a note rental, lease, consignment. She didn't own any of it. She was renting her lifestyle. She was paying monthly fees to look rich. Miles said they were both drowning. He said they were robbing Peter to pay Paul, and now they had run out of Peters. That was it. That was the motive. The $700,000 wasn't for an investment. It wasn't even to buy luxury goods. Really, it was a stopgap. It was a frantic attempt to plug the holes in a sinking ship before the water reached their necks. I felt a surge of anger. But it was mixed with a strange, cold pity. They were pathetic. They were destroying my grandfather. Destroying me. Just to keep up a lie that was already dead. I closed the folder. I told Miles that I had enough. I said I could take this to Earl. I said this proved they were desperate enough to steal. Miles shook his head. He said, wait. He said I hadn't seen the last page. He said there was a twist. He said he found something that didn't fit the pattern of a couple trying to save their marriage and their lifestyle. He slid a small printout across the desk. It was an email confirmation from a travel agency. It was a flight itinerary, a one-way ticket from Raleigh-Durham to the Cayman Islands. The departure date was December 26th, the day after Christmas. I looked at the passenger name, Gavin Mercer. I frowned. Mercer. That wasn't his last name. His last name was Sterling. Miles tapped the paper. He said, look at the second passenger. I looked. Sloan Mercer. I looked up at Miles, confused. I asked who Sloan Mercer was. Miles said he did some digging. He said Sloan Mercer was a 24-year-old barista who worked at the coffee shop where Gavin spent his days. He said she had quit her job 2 days ago. The air left the room. Gavin wasn't trying to save his marriage. He wasn't trying to save his house. He wasn't even trying to save face. He was running. He was stealing $700,000 from my grandfather, using me as the scapegoat, using Brielle as the mule to pick up the cash and the goods. And then he was going to hop on a plane the day after Christmas and vanish with his girlfriend. He was going to leave Brielle behind to face the police, the debt collectors, and the shame. I sat there, stunned. I hated Brielle. She had bullied me my entire life. She was currently framing me for a felony. She was cruel, vain, and shallow, but she was also being played. She was walking into luxury stores, signing her name, or rather, my name on receipts, thinking she and Gavin were partners in crime. She thought they were Bonnie and Clyde. She didn't realize she was just the getaway driver who was going to be left in the burning car. I felt a wave of nausea. This was evil on a level I hadn't anticipated. Gavin was a parasite. He had eaten through his own life, and now he was eating through ours before moving on to a new host. I stood up. My legs felt shaky. I asked Miles if he was sure about this. He nodded. He said the tickets were non-refundable. He said Gavin had also moved a small chunk of money, about $50,000, into an offshore account under the name Mercer last week. He said the $700,000 was the main payload. Once he got his hands on that liquid cash, he was gone. I grabbed the folder. I held it to my chest like a shield. I told Miles I had to go. I told him I had to get to Earl. I drove back to Crescent Bluff in a daze. The Christmas lights were up on the lampposts now, festive and bright, mocking the darkness I was carrying in the passenger seat. I pulled into the service entrance of the estate again, parking in the shadows. I texted Earl, "Come to the greenhouse, now." He met me there 10 minutes later, wrapped in a heavy wool coat. The greenhouse was his sanctuary, filled with the orchids he had loved since my grandmother died. It was warm and humid, smelling of damp earth and moss. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't try to soften the blow. I laid the photos on the potting bench. I showed him the termination letter. I showed him the gambling debts. Earl looked at them, his face gray and still. He didn't say a word. He just flipped through the pages, his hand trembling slightly. Then I showed him the flight itinerary. I told him, "Grandpa, listen to me. I said the $700,000 isn't an investment. It isn't a mistake. I said it is a test run." I looked him in the eye. I said Gavin is desperate. He is in debt up to his eyeballs. He is planning to leave the country in 3 weeks. I said $700,000 is a lot of money, but it isn't enough to sustain a life on the run forever. Not for a man like Gavin. I said if he gets away with this, if he thinks he has fooled us, he won't stop at the cash. I grabbed Earl's hand. It felt cold and fragile. I told him that Gavin was coming for everything. I told him that Gavin likely had papers drawn up to take control of the entire estate. I told him Gavin needed a big score to disappear with. I said, "He is going to try to liquidate you. Grandpa, he is going to try to get you to sign over the house, the accounts, the land. He's going to try to take it all before he gets on that plane." Earl looked up from the papers. The sorrow in his eyes was heartbreaking. He looked at the photo of Brielle, smiling in her rented dress. He asked, "Does she know? Does she know he's leaving her?" I shook my head. I said no. I said she thinks she is winning. She thinks she is the queen of the chessboard. She doesn't know she is just a pawn that's about to be sacrificed. Earl straightened up. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the orchids. He said he had built this family from nothing. He said he had made mistakes. He said he had let them become soft. He said he had let them become vultures. But he said he was not dead yet. He looked at me. He said, "Kendall, you were right. You were right about everything." He asked me what we were going to do. I looked at the flight date again, December 26th. I said we have time. Not much, but enough. I said we aren't going to stop him. Not yet. I said we are going to let him think he has won. We are going to let him think the money is safe. We are going to let him think you are confused and pliable. I said we are going to wait until he makes his final move. We are going to wait until he tries to take the rest. I said, we are going to catch him with his hand in the cookie jar. Grandpa, but not just for the money. We are going to expose him for the flight. We are going to show Brielle exactly who she married. Earl nodded. A grim determination settled over his features. He said, "Okay." He said, "Let's play the game." I looked out the glass walls of the greenhouse at the main house, glowing in the distance. The enemy was inside, sleeping in silk sheets, dreaming of beaches and escape. He didn't know that the girl with the $300 check was standing in the dark, holding the match that was going to burn his entire world down. The air in the greenhouse was heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids, but the document Earl placed on the potting bench smelled like ink and betrayal. Earl smoothed the paper with a hand that was trembling, not from age, but from a rage he was fighting to contain. He told me to look at paragraph 4. I leaned in under the grow lights. The document was titled, "The Graham Family Asset Protection and Tax Efficiency Trust." It sounded boring. It sounded safe. It was exactly the kind of title Gavin would use to put a restless mind to sleep. But as I read the legal jargon, the blood in my veins turned to ice. The clause stated that due to the declining cognitive health of the primary grantor, Earl full administrative power, including the right to liquidate assets, sell real estate, and manage all banking institutions, would be transferred to the trustee. I looked at the name of the trustee. It was not my mother. It was not a neutral law firm. It was Gavin Mercer. Earl whispered that Gavin had been pushing this in front of him for weeks. He said Gavin called it a formality. He said Gavin told him it was just to save the estate 40% in death taxes. He said Gavin promised that nothing would actually change, that it was just a piece of paper to keep the government away. I looked up at my grandfather. I asked him if he had signed it. Earl shook his head slowly. He said he had stalled. He said he told Gavin he needed to read the fine print. But he admitted that before the turkey incident, before the $300 check turned into a $700,000 nightmare, he had been close to signing. He had trusted Gavin. He had believed that the young man in the suit actually cared about the legacy. He tapped the paper with a soil-stained finger. He said the $700,000 was not just theft, it was a test. He said Gavin was checking the perimeter fences. He wanted to see if Earl would notice a significant withdrawal. He wanted to see if the bank would flag it. And most importantly, he wanted to see if he could successfully frame me for it. If the transfer had gone through unnoticed, or if the family had simply accepted that poor, desperate Kendall took the money. Gavin would have known the coast was clear. He would have known that Earl was vulnerable enough to be harvested. I felt a surge of nausea. It was predatory. It was the behavior of a wolf culling the herd. I told Earl that we needed the original. I told him this was a copy. We needed to know exactly what version Gavin was preparing for the final signature. Earl told me the originals were in the library, in the safe. He said he couldn't go back in there right now without Gavin hovering over him. Gavin had been shadowing him like a prison warden since Thanksgiving. I told him I would go. I told him I still had my key to the back door. I told him everyone was out at the country club for the Friday night mixer. The house should be empty. I left Earl in the greenhouse and made my way through the dark garden. The rain had started again, a cold mist that clung to my hair. I slipped into the house through the mudroom, the silence of the mansion pressing against my ears. I moved through the hallways like a ghost. I knew which floorboards creaked. I knew how to avoid the motion sensors by hugging the walls. I made it to the library door, my heart hammering against my ribs. But the house was not empty. I heard voices. They were coming from the small sitting room adjacent to the library. The door was cracked open just an inch. I froze. I recognized the voices immediately. It was my mother, Celeste, and my sister, Brielle. They were not at the country club. I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath. I should have left. I should have run. But something in their tone made me stay. They were arguing. But it was a hushed, frantic argument. Brielle was crying. Not her usual theatrical sobbing, but real, ugly tears of panic. She said she didn't know what to do. She said the credit card company was calling her cell phone. She said they were going to decline the charge for the catering for the Christmas Eve party. She said if the card was declined in front of the vendors, she would die of humiliation. My mother's voice was sharp, cutting through the panic. She told Brielle to pull herself together. She said crying gave you wrinkles. Brielle whined that she needed $12,000 by tomorrow morning. She said Gavin told her the funds were tied up in allocations and would clear next week, but she couldn't wait next week. I waited for my mother to scold her. I waited for Celeste to tell Brielle to get a job, or to stop spending money she didn't have. Instead, I heard the sound of a velvet box snapping open. My mother's voice softened. She said, "Take this." There was a pause. Then Brielle gasped. She asked if this was Grandma's pearl choker, the one with the sapphire clasp. I stopped breathing. That necklace was the one thing my grandmother had specifically promised me. She had worn it on her wedding day. When I was 16, she had fastened it around my neck and told me that when I got married, or when I achieved my first big success, it would be mine. It was listed in the family trust as a specific bequest to Kendall Graham. My mother said, "Take it to the jeweler on 4th Street. He will give you cash. Do not pawn it. Sell it." Brielle hesitated. She asked, "Isn't this for Kendall?" She said she thought Grandma wanted Kendall to have it. My mother's reply was so cold, so matter-of-fact, that it felt like a physical blow to my chest. She said, "Kendall doesn't need pearls to teach music in a public school." She said, "Kendall is used to enduring things. She is used to going without. She is a survivor." "Brielle, you are not," she said. "You are the one who has to keep up the image of this family. If you look poor, We all look poor. Kendall is already a lost cause. I slid down the wall until I was crouching on the floor. I didn't cry. I didn't feel like crying. I felt like something inside me had just been cauterized. For years. I had thought my mother's coldness was just disappointment. I thought if I worked harder, if I was kinder, if I was more successful, she would finally see me. I thought she was just tough on me to make me stronger, but I was wrong. She didn't want me to be strong. She needed me to be the sacrifice. She was willing to burn my inheritance, my memories, and my dignity just to keep Brielle warm for another week. She was feeding me to the wolves to save the sheep she preferred. I listened as Brielle sniffled and accepted the box. I heard them discussing how to explain its disappearance to Earl. My mother suggested they say it was lost during cleaning, or perhaps that I had taken it and sold it myself. That was the final straw. They were already planning to frame me for this. 2. I stood up. I didn't go into the library. I didn't need the papers anymore. I knew enough. I backed away silently, retracing my steps through the dark hallway, out the mudroom door, and back into the rain. When I got back to the greenhouse, Earl was pacing. He took one look at my face and stopped. He asked if I got the papers. I shook my head. I sat down on a wooden crate and looked at him. I said, "Grandpa, we don't need the papers to know the truth." I told him about the necklace. I told him about the conversation. I told him that his daughter, my mother, was not a victim in this. She was an enabler. She was willing to liquidate the family history to protect the illusion of wealth. Earl sat down heavily. He put his face in his hands. He looked old. He looked defeated. He whispered that he was sorry. He said he had failed me. I reached out and took his hands. They were rough, warm, and real. I said, "No, you didn't fail me, but we are done playing defense." I looked at him with a clarity I had never felt before. The desire for my mother's love was gone. The desire for acceptance was gone. All that was left was the mission. I said, "If we go to the police right now, Gavin will panic." I explained the logic. If we arrested him tonight, he would claim the $700,000 was a misunderstanding. He would claim Brielle opened the LLC. He would claim the flight to the Caymans was a surprise vacation. He would hire a shark lawyer, and with the compliance documents he had been forcing Earl to sign, he might even argue that Earl was mentally incompetent and that Gavin was acting as his protector. And worse, he would destroy Brielle. He would pin the identity theft on her and leave her to rot while he used his hidden stash to flee. I hated Brielle for taking the necklace, but I wasn't going to let Gavin destroy the entire family just so he could sip Mai Tais on a beach with a 24-year-old barista. I said, "We need him to feel safe. We need him to think he has won." Earl looked up. He asked what I had in mind. I said, "The Christmas Eve party. It was in 3 days. The entire social elite of Crescent Bluff would be there. My mother's friends, Gavin's associates, the people whose opinions mattered more to them than oxygen." I told Earl the plan. I said, "On Christmas Eve, you are going to give Gavin what he wants." Earl frowned. He asked if I meant the signature. I nodded. I said, "You are going to play the part, Grandpa. You are going to be the confused, tired old man they think you are. You are going to tell Gavin that you are ready to sign the tax protection papers during the party." I said, "Gavin will be ecstatic. He will be arrogant. He will think he has pulled off the heist of the century. He will relax. He will probably even cancel his backup plans because he thinks he has secured the main vault." Earl's eyes narrowed. He asked, and then I said, "And then, right before the ink dries, we turn on the lights." I told him I needed time to assemble the package. I needed Nina, the prosecutor. I needed Miles to finalize the trace on the offshore accounts. I needed the video footage from the parcel center. I said, "I don't just want to stop him. I want to nuke him." I told Earl that for this to work, I needed a kill shot. I needed undeniable proof that linked Gavin directly to the fraud. Something that bypassed Brielle and the LLC. I told him about the mortgage. Miles had mentioned a secondary line of credit on the main house. To get that, Gavin would have needed Earl's signature on a document before the guardianship was active. I asked Earl if he had signed a mortgage modification 6 months ago. Earl said absolutely not. The house was paid off in 1995. I smiled. A cold, hard smile. I said, "Then he forged it. And forgery of a federal housing document is a felony that doesn't need a complex trial to prove." I stood up. I said, "Grandpa, go back inside. Complain about your memory. Ask Gavin where you put your glasses. Ask him when you can sign those papers to make sure the government doesn't take the money." I said, "Make him feel like the king of the castle." Earl stood up. He buttoned his coat. He looked at me. and I saw a flash of the man who had built a skyscraper in a thunderstorm. He said, "I can do that. I can play the fool." He paused at the door of the greenhouse. He asked, "What about the necklace?" I touched my throat. "Where the phantom weight of the pearls should have been," I said. "Let it go. It's the price of admission for what comes next." I watched him walk back to the house, a lone figure in the dark. I got into my car. I didn't turn on the radio. I drove back to my small apartment, the one with the drafty windows and the noisy heater. I took a shower and washed the rain and the mud off my skin. I looked in the mirror. I didn't look like a victim anymore. I looked like a prosecutor preparing her opening statement. My mother had said I was used to enduring. She was right, but she forgot one thing about people who endure: we survive. And eventually, we stop just surviving. We start settling the score. I picked up my phone and dialed Miles. I said, "Miles, get Nina on the line. We are going to throw a party." I invited Brielle to meet me at the Glass House, a solarium-style cafe in downtown Raleigh where the latte foam art was more important than the coffee itself. It was neutral ground, but it was her territory. I knew she would feel comfortable there, surrounded by influencers and socialites. Comfort breeds carelessness. I arrived early and secured a corner table. I taped the small, high-fidelity recorder Miles had given me to the underside of the table, right near where Brielle would sit. I checked the connection to my phone, which was recording via Bluetooth. When Brielle arrived, she was 20 minutes late. She wore oversized sunglasses and the nervous, irritated energy of someone who felt put upon. She did not hug me. She sat down, ordered a sparkling water with lime, and looked at me with open disdain. I started the performance. I slumped my shoulders. I kept my voice low and wavering. I told her I was sorry. I told her the dinner had been a mistake. I said I was just stressed about money and jealous of her success. I said I didn't want to fight anymore. Brielle relaxed instantly. Her posture softened. She took a sip of her water and sighed, a sound that was half pity, half triumph. She said she was glad I finally came to my senses. She said I had really embarrassed everyone. She said Mom was beside herself. I nodded, staring at the table. I asked her, keeping my voice innocent, why she did it. I asked why she used my name for the LLC. I said I wasn't mad. I just didn't understand why she didn't use her own. Brielle laughed. It was a light, tinkling sound that made my skin crawl. She said I was so naive. She said it was about tax optimization. She said Gavin explained it all. She said my name was clean. She said Grandpa trusted me, so when he saw my name on the transfer, he wouldn't ask questions. She said if she had used her name, Grandpa would have lectured her about spending. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She said they were actually doing me a favor. She said building a credit history for my company would help me in the long run. She said I should be thanking them for the structure. It was the confession I needed. She had admitted to the deception. She had admitted to using my identity to bypass Earl's scrutiny. I felt a surge of victory. I had it. Then, a shadow fell over the table. I looked up. Gavin was standing there. He wasn't supposed to be here. Brielle hadn't checked her phone, but Gavin was paranoid. He must have been tracking her location. Or she had told him she was meeting me despite my request for privacy. He didn't say a word. He looked at me. Then he looked at the phone sitting on the table between us. He looked at the way I was leaning in. His eyes went to the underside of the glass table. The black tape holding the recorder was visible through the transparent surface if you knew where to look. And Gavin, for all his faults, had the survival instincts of a cornered rat. He reached under the table. He ripped the device off the glass. Brielle gasped. She asked what he was doing. Gavin didn't look at her. He looked at me. He dropped the small black square onto the concrete floor. He lifted his expensive Italian leather boot and brought it down. Crunch. The plastic shattered. The memory card inside was crushed into dust. He picked up my water glass and poured it over the debris, just to be sure. He smiled. It was a terrifying, dead smile. He told me I was out of my depth. He said if I ever tried to record his wife again, he would sue me for illegal wiretapping. He said in North Carolina, you need consent. He was lying. It is a one-party consent state, but he knew I didn't have the money to fight him in court. He grabbed Brielle's arm, hard enough to bruise. He told her to get up. He told her I was toxic. He leaned down to my ear. He whispered that I should be careful. He said accidents happen to people who ask too many questions. They walked out, leaving me with a pile of wet plastic and a bill for 2 drinks. I thought that was the low point. I was wrong. The next morning, the doorbell rang at 7 o'clock. It was a process server. He handed me a thick envelope. I opened it in my kitchen. my hands shaking. It was a temporary restraining order. Petitioner Earl Graham, represented by Gavin Mercer. Power of attorney. The document alleged that I, Kendall Graham, had engaged in elder abuse and psychological manipulation. It claimed I had harassed Earl, causing him distress and confusion. It cited the outburst at Thanksgiving as evidence of my unstable behavior. The order barred me from coming within 500 feet of Earl Graham or the Crescent Bluff estate. It barred me from contacting him by phone or email. Gavin had cut the line. He knew Earl was my only ally, so he had used the legal system to isolate him. Earl probably didn't even know what he had signed. Or worse, Gavin had forged his signature on the petition. I sank onto my kitchen floor. I couldn't warn Earl. I couldn't tell him about the plan for Christmas Eve. If I tried, I would be arrested. 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was the principal of Marigold Ridge Arts Magnet. Her voice was tight. She said she was sorry. She said they had received an anonymous complaint from a concerned community member. The complaint alleged that I was suffering from a severe mental health crisis and had exhibited erratic behavior that could endanger students. I tried to argue. I tried to tell her it was a lie. She cut me off. She said the school board had a zero-tolerance policy for liability. She said I was being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending an investigation. I dropped the phone. I sat in the silence of my apartment. No job, no grandfather, no evidence. Then came the third blow. My mother, Celeste, did not call. She used her key. She walked into my apartment at noon. She didn't take off her coat. She looked around my small living room with its thrift store furniture and the pile of sheet music on the floor, her nose wrinkling in disgust. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask why I had lost my job. She threw a tablet onto the sofa. She told me to look at what I had done. I picked it up. It was Brielle's Instagram. She had posted a black and white photo of herself looking out a rainy window. The caption read, "It is so hard when the people you love turn out to be toxic. Jealousy is a disease. Sending love to everyone dealing with family trauma this holiday season. We have to protect our peace." The comments were a flood of support. "Stay strong, Queen. Jealousy is ugly. You don't need that energy." My mother stood over me. She was trembling with rage. She said I was embarrassing the family. She said people were talking. She said Mrs. Abernathy at the club had asked her if I was on drugs. She asked me why I couldn't just be happy for my sister. She asked why I had to ruin everything. I looked up at her. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me. I said, "Mom, Gavin stole $700,000. She froze. For a second, I saw a flicker of doubt, but then she crushed it. She couldn't handle the truth. The truth was messy. The truth would ruin the Christmas party. She said I was delusional. She said Gavin was a successful businessman. She said I was projecting my own failures onto him. She told me that if I didn't stop this crusade, she would cut me off completely. No more family dinners. No more contact. She walked out. I sat there for a long time. The silence in the apartment was deafening. I felt like I was underwater. The pressure was immense. I had tried to do the right thing. I had tried to fight. And for my trouble, I had been stripped of my career, my family, and my reputation. I was completely alone. I checked my bank account. I had $400 left. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red. My hair was a mess. But as I stared at my own reflection, something shifted. They had taken my job. They had taken my family. They had taken my reputation, which meant I had absolutely nothing left to lose. Fear requires something to protect. I had nothing to protect anymore. I wasn't a teacher anymore. I wasn't a granddaughter. I wasn't a daughter. I was just a woman with a truth that nobody wanted to hear. I grabbed my coat. I drove to Miles's office. When I walked in, Miles was on the phone. He took one look at my face and hung up. He didn't ask what happened. He knew. He had probably seen the social media posts. He probably knew about the restraining order. He stood up and walked to the door of the back office. He waved me over. He said there was someone I needed to meet. Sitting at a small conference table was a woman I recognized, though I hadn't seen her in 10 years. Nina Hart. We had gone to high school together, back then. She was the quiet girl who read true crime novels during lunch. Now, she was wearing a sharp navy blazer and looking at a file with the intensity of a hawk. She stood up and shook my hand. Her grip was firm. She said Miles had briefed her. She said she was currently an assistant district attorney specializing in financial crimes. She said she hated two things in this world: people who hurt kids and people who hunted the elderly. I sat down. I told her everything. I told her about the failed recording. I told her about the restraining order. I told her about the job. Nina listened. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered analysis. She said the restraining order was a mistake. I looked at her, confused. I asked how being legally banned from seeing my grandfather was a mistake for Gavin. Nina smiled. It was a sharp, dangerous smile. She said it showed he was afraid. She said innocent people don't file restraining orders against family members over a dinner table argument. She said it established a pattern of isolation. She leaned forward. She said, Kendall, right now, you are playing checkers. Gavin is playing chess, but he is a bad chess player. He is aggressive. He attacks too early. She said we needed to change the game. She told me that to get an indictment that would stick one that would freeze his assets immediately and stop him from boarding that plane, we needed 3 things. First, proof of intent. The flight tickets and the offshore account established that. Second, the money trail. Miles had that. But the third thing was the hardest. We needed the beneficiary to incriminate himself. We needed him to claim the money or the power explicitly. She said the signature on the tax protection document was the key. If Earl signed that document, he was legally handing Gavin control. But if we could prove that Gavin tricked him into signing it while knowing about the theft, it became fraud in the inducement. It became a federal crime. I told her I couldn't get near Earl, the restraining order. Nina tapped her pen on the table. She said, You don't need to be near him. You just need to be in the room when the trap snaps shut. She asked me about the party. She asked if there would be a lot of people there. I said yes, the whole town. She said, Good. Witnesses are better than recordings. Recordings can be destroyed. A room full of 50 wealthy people watching a man get arrested. That is forever. She said we were going to crash the party, but not as guests. She looked at Miles. She asked if the dossier was ready. Miles nodded. He patted a thick stack of documents. Nina looked at me. She said, Get some sleep. Kendall, you look like hell. She said, On Christmas Eve, we aren't just going to stop him. We are going to let him make his speech. We are going to let him hold the pen. We are going to let him think he is the smartest man in the room, she said. And then we are going to introduce him to the United States Department of Justice. I looked at her. For the first time in 24 hours, the crushing weight on my chest lifted. I wasn't alone. I had a team, and we were going to bring the house down. The next 48 hours were not spent in mourning the loss of my career or my family's standing. They were spent in a windowless conference room at the district attorney's office, turning my life into a weapon. Nina Hart did not play games. She worked the phones with a terrifying efficiency, leveraging old law school connections and calling in favors. By Wednesday afternoon, she had established a channel with a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. She told me they were interested. Harbor Wake Holdings, the offshore entity Miles had flagged, was already on a watch list for laundering money for cryptocurrency scams. But interest was not action. Nina made it clear that they would not swoop in based on a hunch. They needed a triggering event. They needed the crime to cross the line from preparation to execution in a way that was undeniable. That meant we needed Earl to play his part perfectly, because of the restraining order. I could not call him. I could not visit him. But Miles could. Miles went to the estate under the guise of an old friend dropping off a Christmas gift, a bottle of scotch that contained a burner phone taped to the back of the box. We listened in from Nina's office as Earl made the call to Gavin. The audio was crisp. I heard my grandfather's voice, but it was not the strong baritone I knew. It was thin, wavering, and laced with a pathetic sort of desperation. He was channeling every ounce of the frailty the family accused him of having. He told Gavin he was scared. He said he had been looking at the news, and he was terrified the government was going to change the tax laws before the new year. He asked if that protection paper was still on the table. He said he wanted to sign it. He said he wanted to make sure everything was safe. I held my breath. Gavin's voice came through, dripping with false sympathy. It was the voice of a man suppressing a cheer. He told Earl not to worry. He said he would have the papers ready. He suggested they do it on Christmas Eve, during the party. He said it would be a poetic way to secure the family legacy, surrounded by friends and loved ones. It was exactly what we wanted. Gavin's ego demanded an audience. He did not just want to steal the kingdom. He wanted to be crowned in front of the court. Nina cut the feed. She looked at me and nodded. She said he took the bait. She said now we had a time and a place. My role for the next 2 days was to disappear. I had to sell the narrative that I was broken. I deactivated my Instagram and Facebook. I did not answer texts. I left my apartment dark. I let Gavin believe that his restraining order and the school suspension had crushed me into dust. I needed him to believe I was cowering in my bed, too ashamed to show my face. While I played the ghost, Miles was cementing the trap. He came back to the conference room on Thursday morning with a finalized flowchart that looked like the schematic for a bomb. He had traced the $700,000 with surgical precision. It went from Earl's primary checking account to Kendall Graham Arts LLC. Then, within 24 hours, it moved to a holding account in a digital bank based in Delaware. From there, it was wired to Harborwake Holdings in the Cayman Islands. But here was the smoking gun. Miles had managed to get the incorporation documents for Harborwake Holdings through a contact in the Caribbean. The company was not anonymous. The primary beneficiary was listed as Gavin Mercer. The money went from Earl, through a shell with my name, directly into Gavin's pocket, but Miles was not done. He looked grim. He said there was something else. He said that while digging into Gavin's liquidity to understand why he needed the money so badly, he found a lien. He slid a property deed across the table. It was the deed to my parents' house, the house I grew up in, the house my mother treated like a shrine. There was a second mortgage taken out on it 3 months ago, a high-interest, short-term loan for $200,000. I stared at the signatures at the bottom. Randall Graham, Celeste Graham. I told Miles that my parents would never do that. My mother thought mortgages were for poor people. She prided herself on owning everything outright. Miles handed me a magnifying glass. He told me to look at the witness signature. It was Gavin. He said the signatures were forged. He said Gavin had used his access to their personal files to steal the deed, forge their names, and leverage their home to pay off his gambling debts in September. The $700,000 wasn't just his exit strategy. It was the only thing stopping the bank from foreclosing on my parents' house. He was robbing the grandfather to pay off the loan he took out on the parents, all while planning to leave the country before the house of cards collapsed. I felt a cold fury settle in my stomach. I had spent days feeling angry for myself, angry for Earl, but this was a violation of the two people who had defended him. My mother had sold my grandmother's pearls to help him, unaware that he had already sold her roof. Nina looked at the documents. She said this was it. She said this was the nail in the coffin. She told me to build the presentation. I spent the entire night of December 23rd working on my laptop. I did not make a complex legal argument. I made a slideshow. I treated it like a lesson plan for my kindergartners, simple, visual, and impossible to misunderstand. Slide 1, the money, a clear graphic showing the $700,000 leaving Earl and landing in Gavin's offshore account. Slide 2, the imposter, the video footage of Brielle picking up packages, side by side with the LLC registration. This would clear my name and implicate Brielle as a pawn. Slide 3, the flight, the one-way ticket for Gavin and Sloan Mercer. Slide 4, the betrayal, the forged mortgage documents on my parents' house. I saved the file to a USB drive. I also uploaded it to a cloud server that I could access from any device. The plan was simple, but the timing had to be exquisite. Earl had arranged for a large monitor to be set up in the main drawing room for the party. He had told Gavin he wanted to play a tribute video to the family history before the signing. Gavin, loving anything that glorified the family and by extension, him, had agreed. He had even connected the screen to the main house system. I knew the system. I had set it up for my father 3 years ago. I knew the override code. I would not need to touch the computer physically. I could hijack the feed from my phone if I was on the local Wi-Fi. Nina gave me my final instructions. She said I could not just barge in. The restraining order gave the police probable cause to arrest me on site. If I was arrested before the evidence was shown, Gavin would spin it. He would say I was a stalker crashing the party. She said I had to walk in at the exact moment the signing began. I had to use the element of surprise. She said, "We will have plainclothes officers outside. We will be listening. Once the evidence is up and the room turns, we move in. But you have to hold the floor for 2 minutes. You have to survive the social pressure long enough for the truth to land." I went home and looked at my closet. I pulled out the clothes I usually wore to family gatherings, the modest, beige cardigans, the sensible skirts designed to make me invisible. I threw them on the floor. I reached to the back of the closet. I found a black jumpsuit I had bought years ago and never worn because I thought it was too bold. It was sharp, tailored, and severe. I put it on. I put on heels that added 3 inches to my height. I pulled my hair back into a tight, high ponytail. I applied red lipstick, not the soft pink my mother approved of. Red, war paint. I looked in the mirror. The sad music teacher was gone. The victim was gone. The woman in the mirror looked like an executioner. I drove to Crescent Bluff as the sun went down on Christmas Eve. The estate was lit up like a carnival. Valets were running back and forth. parking Bentleys and Porsches. I did not go to the front gate. I parked my car a half-mile away, in the lot of a nearby trailhead. I walked through the woods that bordered the estate, the cold winter air biting at my exposed skin. I knew the gap in the fence where the deer came through. I knew the path to the terrace doors. I waited in the shadows of the rhododendrons, watching the party through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was sickeningly perfect. There was a 12-foot tree shimmering with crystal ornaments. There was a string quartet playing soft carols. Waiters circulated with champagne. I saw my mother, Celeste. She was wearing a silver gown, laughing with the mayor's wife, completely unaware that she was effectively homeless. I saw Brielle. She was holding her phone up, live streaming. She was showing off her outfit, posing with guests, selling the fantasy of the Graham family Christmas. She looked beautiful and hollow. And I saw Gavin. He was standing by the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a scotch. He looked relaxed. He looked victorious. He was nodding at something my father was saying, acting the part of the dutiful son-in-law. Earl was sitting in his favorite armchair near the center of the room. He looked small. He had a blanket over his lap. He was playing his part well. Every few minutes, he would look around with a dazed expression, and Gavin would pat his shoulder patronizingly. At 8 o'clock, the music stopped. Gavin stepped forward. He tapped a spoon against his glass. The room went silent. He began to speak. His voice was smooth, projected with the confidence of a man who believes he is untouchable. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about the challenges of the year. He talked about legacy. He talked about how hard it was to watch the patriarch decline, gesturing sadly to Earl. He said that tonight, they were taking a step to ensure the Graham name lived on. He said Earl had graciously decided to hand over the reins of the estate management to ensure stability. He signaled to a lawyer standing nearby, who brought over a leather portfolio. Gavin pulled out a gold pen. He uncapped it. He handed it to Earl. The room held its breath. My mother clasped her hands to her chest, looking moved. Brielle zoomed in with her phone. This was it. Earl took the pen. His hand shook. He looked at the paper, then he looked up. He looked directly at the terrace doors where I was hiding. He spoke into the silence. His voice was not weak anymore. He said, "Before I sign this, Gavin, I think we should watch that tribute." Gavin smiled indulgently. He said, "Of course, Earl. Anything you want." Gavin nodded to the AV technician in the corner. That was my signal. I pulled out my phone. I connected to the Graham guest Wi-Fi. I entered the admin override for the media server. I hijacked the signal. I stepped out of the shadows. I opened the terrace door. A blast of cold air followed me into the warm, perfumed room. Heads turned. The murmur of confusion started instantly. My mother saw me first. Her face went pale. She started to rush forward, her mouth opening to scold me, to tell me to leave, to tell me I was ruining everything. But I didn't look at her. I didn't look at Brielle. I looked at Gavin. He froze. He took a step toward me, his face twisting into a mask of fury. He opened his mouth to call security. He was going to cite the restraining order. He was going to have me dragged out, but he was too late. Behind him, on the massive 80-inch screen above the fireplace, the tribute began. It wasn't a montage of old family photos. It was a bank transfer receipt. The numbers $700,000 were projected in high definition, looming over Gavin's head like a guillotine blade. I walked into the center of the room. My heels clicked on the hardwood floor, a rhythm of impending judgment. I didn't need a microphone. My voice was trained for auditoriums. I said, "Merry Christmas. Gavin, I think you forgot to declare a few assets." The room went dead silent. And then, the slide changed. The room smelled of expensive pine candles, and even more expensive perfume. It was a suffocating, golden scent that usually signaled the height of the holiday season in Crescent Bluff. I stood in the shadow of the velvet drapes near the terrace door, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I was an intruder in my own history, watching the final act of a play that had been written to erase me. Gavin stood in front of the massive stone fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on his face. He held a microphone loosely in one hand, his other hand resting possessively on the mantel, as if he were already measuring it for a renovation. He looked the part of the grieving, burdened successor perfectly. His suit was dark, his tie was somber, and his expression was a carefully calibrated mix of strength and sorrow. He looked out at the sea of faces: the mayor, the partners from the law firm, the neighbors who controlled the HOA board, and he smiled sadly. He spoke about the passage of time. He spoke about how hard it was to watch a titan fade. He gestured toward Earl, who was sitting in his leather armchair with a blanket tucked around his knees, looking small and vacant. Gavin said that it was our duty, as the younger generation, to step up. He said we had to protect the legacy when the mind that built it could no longer hold the details. He used the word stewardship 3 times. He used the word burden twice. He was painting a portrait of himself as a martyr who was willing to carry the heavy load of the Graham millions out of sheer love. My mother, Celeste, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She was standing to Gavin's left, nodding in agreement, playing the role of the supportive matriarch. She looked relieved. In her mind, the signature that was about to happen would solve everything. It would pay the bills, hide the debts, and keep the lights on in the theater of her life. Gavin turned to the lawyer, a man named Mr. Henderson, who looked bored, and nodded. Henderson stepped forward with the leather portfolio. He opened it on the small side table next to Earl. He smoothed out the document. The paper was thick and cream-colored. It looked official. It looked final. Gavin leaned down. His voice dropped to a gentle, patronizing register, amplified by the speakers so everyone could hear his benevolence. He said, "Earl, just right here, like we practiced. It is just to keep the taxman away. You trust me, don't you?" Earl looked at the pen. His hand trembled. It was a magnificent performance. He lifted the pen, the gold nib hovering over the signature line. The room went deathly silent. Brielle moved closer, her phone raised high to capture the historic transfer of power. I tightened my grip on my phone. My thumb hovered over the execute button on the screen. Earl's pen touched the paper. Then, it stopped. He didn't sign. He didn't drop the pen. He simply froze. He looked up. The vacuous, confused look vanished from his eyes, replaced by a glint of steel that I hadn't seen in months. He looked directly at Gavin. He spoke clearly, his voice cutting through the silence without the need for a microphone. He said, "Actually, Gavin, before I sign away my life, I want to see the gift Kendall prepared. She told me she made a video for tonight." Gavin froze. His smile faltered, twitching at the corners. He looked confused. He said, "Kendall isn't here. Earl, you know that. Kendall isn't well." Earl leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over the blanket. He said, "I want to see the video." Gavin looked at the crowd. He let out a nervous chuckle. He was trying to figure out how to handle the senile outburst without ruining the mood. He signaled to the AV technician in the corner, a subtle slash of his hand across his throat to cut the feed. But I was already in the system. I pressed the button on my phone, the massive 80-inch screen above the fireplace, which had been displaying a looping video of falling snow, flickered black. Then, a harsh, bright white light flooded the room. I stepped out from the curtains. I walked into the center of the room, my heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. I was wearing the black jumpsuit, standing tall, refusing to look at the floor. Gavin spun around. He saw me. His eyes went wide. He raised the microphone to shout, to order security, to call me crazy, but a collective gasp from the room drowned him out. On the screen, the first slide appeared. It was not a sentimental montage. It was a flowchart. It was brutal in its simplicity. The header read, "The Trail." On the left was a scan of Earl's bank statement, showing a wire transfer of $700,000. An arrow pointed to the middle column, Kendall Graham Arts LLC, and then a red arrow, thick and accusing, pointed to the final destination, Harbor Wake Holdings, Cayman Islands. Underneath the final box, in bold text, was the name of the sole beneficiary of Harbor Wake Holdings, Gavin Mercer. The silence in the room broke. It wasn't a roar. It was a ripple of whispers that sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. People were leaning in. They were putting on their reading glasses. These were people who understood money. They understood wire transfers. They understood that you do not accidentally wire nearly $1 million to an offshore account. Gavin stared at the screen. His face drained of color. He shouted that this was a lie. He said I had photoshopped it. He said I was trying to frame him. I didn't argue. I didn't scream back. I just swiped my thumb across my phone screen. Slide 2. The video footage from the parcel concierge began to play. It was grainy but unmistakable. There was Brielle, wearing her oversized sunglasses and her trench coat. She was tapping her nails on the counter. She was signing for a stack of boxes. The camera zoomed in on the label on the box, Kendall Graham Arts LLC. Then, the video cut to the clip of Brielle carrying the chartreuse electric lime handbag. Next to the video, I had placed a screenshot of her Instagram story from the same week, showing off the bag. The timestamps matched perfectly. The caption on the slide read, "The Mule." I looked at Brielle. She had lowered her phone. She was staring at the screen, her mouth slightly open. She looked at the video. Then she looked at Gavin. She wasn't angry yet. She was confused. She was realizing that her tax optimization strategy was actually a documented felony, and she was the star of the show. My mother let out a small, strangled sound. She looked from the screen to Brielle, her eyes widening as the implication hit her. The daughter she had protected, the perfect one, was being projected on a 20-foot screen committing fraud. Gavin lunged toward the AV technician. He screamed at him to turn it off. The kid held up his hands, terrified, pointing at his console, which was completely locked out. I swiped again. Slide 3. This was the character assassination. On the left side of the screen was the termination letter from the investment firm in Charlotte. The words compliance violation and unauthorized trading were highlighted in yellow. The date was August. On the right side were the bank statements. Bet Limitless, Vegas, Direct, Royal Flush Poker. The numbers were red. -5,000, -12,000, -20,000. The whispers in the room grew louder. I heard the word unemployed. I heard the word broke. I heard the word gambler. Gavin turned to the crowd. He was sweating now. Beads of perspiration were glistening on his forehead in the firelight. He held out his hands. He said, "This is insane. She is mentally unstable. Look at the formatting. Anyone can type this up. I am managing a private fund. This is slander." He was losing them. I could see it in their eyes. The mayor took a step back. The partners from the law firm crossed their arms. They were distancing themselves from the blast radius. I looked at Gavin. I spoke for the first time. My voice was calm, almost bored. I said, "You are right. Gavin, anyone can type up a document, but not anyone can buy a plane ticket." I swiped again. Slide 4. The screen displayed the flight itinerary. Raleigh-Durham to Grand Cayman. One way. Date December 26th. The room went quiet again. December 26th was 2 days away. But the eyes didn't stay on the date. They drifted to the passenger list. Passenger 1, Gavin Mercer. Passenger 2, Sloane Mercer. I saw the moment Brielle's soul left her body. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She just went completely still. She looked at the name, Sloane. She knew the name. Maybe she had seen a text message. Maybe she had seen a coffee cup with a name written on it. Or maybe she just knew, with a wife's instinct, that she wasn't the woman on the ticket. She turned to Gavin. Her face was a mask of absolute devastation. She whispered, "Who is Sloane?" Gavin didn't answer her. He couldn't. He was staring at the screen, looking at his escape hatch being welded shut in front of 50 witnesses. He started to back away. He looked toward the door. But I wasn't done. I had one more slide. The one for my mother. I swiped. Slide 5. The deed to the Graham family estate. My parents' house. The document showed a second mortgage lien for $200,000. The interest rate was predatory 18%. At the bottom were the signatures, Randall Graham and Celeste Graham, and next to them, the witness Gavin Mercer. I looked at my mother. She was staring at the screen. She knew she hadn't signed that. She knew my father hadn't signed that. She looked at the date, September. She realized that for 3 months, she had been living in a house that didn't fully belong to her anymore. She realized that the son-in-law she had championed, the man she had allowed to humiliate her own daughter, had forged her name and sold her security to pay his bookie. She let out a sob. It was a raw, ugly sound that didn't belong at a party. She collapsed onto the nearest sofa, clutching her chest. My father stood there, his glass of scotch slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. Gavin looked around the room. He realized the air had changed. It wasn't a party anymore. It wasn't even a scandal. It was an indictment. He looked at the faces of the guests. These were his people. The people he wanted to impress. And now, they were looking at him like he was a disease. They were looking at him with the cold, hard judgment of the wealthy who realize someone has tried to pick their pocket. He turned to me. His eyes were wild. He dropped the sophisticated facade. He pointed a shaking finger at me. He screamed that I was a liar. He screamed that I had hacked the system. He screamed that nothing on that screen was admissible in court. I stepped closer to him. I was 5 feet away. I didn't flinch. I said, "You are wrong about that." 2. I pointed to the metadata timestamp I had included in the corner of every document on the screen. I said, "Every file up there has been verified by a forensic accountant. Every bank transfer has a trace number. Every video has a chain of custody." I said, And the woman who verified them isn't just my friend. She is the assistant district attorney. I saw the blood drain from his face until he looked like a wax figure. I said, "Look around you. Gavin, this isn't a presentation. It's a closing argument. And you just lost Earl, who had been silent this entire time. Threw the blanket off his legs. He stood up. He didn't use his cane. He walked over to Gavin. He stood toe-to-toe with him. Earl reached out and plucked the gold pen from Gavin's hand. He said, 'I think I will keep my signature. Thank you. And I think you should probably start running, son, though I don't think you will make it to the gate.' Gavin looked at the door. He looked at the window. He looked at the guests who had formed a wall of black tuxedos and silver gowns, blocking his path. He was trapped in the center of the luxury he had coveted, suffocated by the very people he wanted to be. The silence stretched, thin and tight as a wire, waiting for the snap. Gavin's attempt to leave was not a run. It was a slide. He did not bolt for the door like a common criminal because, even in the face of annihilation, he could not abandon the delusion that he was a gentleman. He adjusted his cufflinks. He offered a tight, strained smile to the room at large. He held up a hand as if he were pausing a meeting to take an urgent call. He said, loudly enough to be heard over the murmurs, that this was clearly a family misunderstanding. He said there were accounting errors that needed to be cleared up in private. He said he was going to step into the study to call the bank and sort this mess out. He began to walk toward the French doors that led to the side garden, moving with a fast, clipped stride. He was trying to put distance between himself and the screen, between himself and the truth that was glowing 18 feet high above the fireplace. But he never made it to the handle. The heavy oak doors of the main entrance swung open. They did not open for a guest. They opened with the force of authority. 4 officers in uniform stepped into the foyer, flanked by 2 detectives in plain clothes. The cold winter air rushed in behind them, extinguishing the warmth of the party in a single breath. The lead detective, a man with a face like carved granite, scanned the room. He did not look at the crystal chandelier. He did not look at the weeping women in designer gowns. He looked straight at the man trying to slink out the side door. He called out Gavin's name. Gavin froze. For a second, I saw his shoulders hunch, the instinctive reaction of a prey animal realizing the trap has snapped shut. Then, he slowly turned around. He tried one last time. He put on his best, confused executive face. He asked what the meaning of this intrusion was. He asked if they had a warrant. The detective didn't shout. He walked across the polished floor, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. He said they had a warrant for the arrest of Gavin Mercer. He listed the charges: wire fraud, money laundering, aggravated identity theft, forgery of federal documents. Gavin's knees buckled. It wasn't a figure of speech. His legs actually gave out, just for a fraction of a second, before he caught himself on the back of a velvet sofa. The physical weight of the words seemed to crush him. The detective didn't wait for a speech. He signaled to the uniformed officers. They moved in. There was no struggle. There was no dramatic fight. It was almost clinical. They pulled Gavin's hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was a sharp, mechanical sound that echoed off the high ceilings. I watched the faces of the guests. These were the people Gavin had spent 3 years courting. These were the people he had bought drinks for. The people he had tried to impress with his talk of markets and margins. Now, they looked at him with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. They were not looking at a friend. They were looking at a contagion. They were stepping back, pulling their skirts and tuxedo tails away, terrified that the taint of the crime might rub off on them. Gavin looked at me. His eyes were wet. He looked small. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrified look of a child who realizes the dark is real. But the police weren't done. The detective turned his gaze to the group near the fireplace. He looked at Brielle. She was standing next to my mother, trembling. She was clutching her phone like a talisman, but she had stopped streaming. When the detective's eyes landed on her, she let out a whimper. He walked over to her. He spoke quietly, but in the silence of the room, his voice carried. He said he needed her to come down to the station for questioning regarding her involvement in the operations of Kendall Graham Arts LLC. Brielle screamed. It was a high, piercing sound of pure denial. She grabbed my mother's arm. She cried that she didn't do anything. She cried that she was a victim. She pointed a shaking finger at Gavin, who was being led away. She screamed that he made her do it. She screamed that she didn't know about the money. She just picked up the packages. The detective remained impassive. He told her that her signature was on the receiving documents for goods purchased with stolen funds. He said she was a signatory on the shell company's receiving logs. He said, I didn't know was a defense she could present to a judge, but for tonight, she was coming with them. An officer, a female this time, stepped forward and gently but firmly took Brielle's arm. My mother, Celeste, tried to intervene. She grabbed the officer's sleeve. She demanded they stop. She said this was a mistake. She said her daughter was an influencer, a public figure, a good girl. The officer removed my mother's hand. She said interfering with an investigation was a crime, and she suggested my mother step back. Celeste froze. She watched, helpless, as her golden child, her perfect creation, was led away in tears, stumbling in her 6-inch heels, passing the very guests she had been trying to impress just 10 minutes ago. The room was in shock. The music had stopped. The champagne was getting warm. The party was effectively a crime scene. Then, Earl moved. He walked to the center of the room, standing in the empty space where Gavin had just been arrested. He stood straight. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the whispering neighbors and the shocked business partners. He spoke. His voice was gravel and iron. He said he wanted to make one thing clear. He said he was not senile. He said he had not lost his mind. He said the only thing he had lost was his trust in the people who were supposed to protect him. He told them that the guardianship papers, the rumors of his decline, the confusion, it was all a trap. He said he had baited the hook, and Gavin had swallowed it whole. He looked at the guests and said that anyone who thought he was an easy target had just watched what happens when you try to bury a man who is still holding a shovel. A few people nodded. Some looked ashamed. They realized they had been complicit in the narrative of his decline. They had written him off. I stepped forward then. I had one loose end to tie up. I held up a folder. I addressed the detective, who was still coordinating the scene. I said I had my work logs from the school district for the dates the LLC was opened. I had affidavits from 3 teachers who were with me during the times the digital signatures were created. I had a letter from the Secretary of State confirming I had never applied for a business license in my life. I said, just for the record, I didn't steal a dime, and I didn't frame anyone. I just turned on the lights. The detective nodded. He took the folder. He said they had everything they needed. The police began to clear the room. They asked the guests to leave. The party was over. The exodus was fast. The elite of Crescent Bluff did not like to be near the messiness of real life. They grabbed their coats and their furs, murmuring apologies, avoiding eye contact, rushing to their cars to tweet about the scandal from the safety of their leather seats. Soon, the room was empty, just the staff, cleaning up the shattered glass. And my mother? Celeste was sitting on the sofa, staring at the screen where the mortgage document was still frozen. The image of her forged signature loomed over her. She looked broken. The illusion she had spent 40 years building the perfect family, the perfect house, the perfect status had been demolished in 20 minutes. Her son-in-law was a felon. Her favorite daughter was in custody. Her husband was a ghost who had fled to the kitchen to pour a drink. And her house, her stage, was leveraged to the hilt by a gambling addict she had invited in for dinner. She looked up and saw me standing by the door. She stood up. She walked toward me. Her face was streaked with mascara. Her silver gown looked ridiculous now, a costume for a play that had been canceled. She reached out for my hands. Her grip was desperate. She begged me to help. She said, "Kendall, you have to talk to Earl. You have to fix this." She said we could hire a lawyer. We could say it was a mistake. We could bail Brielle out. She said we had to save the house. She said we had to save the family name. She said if this got out, really got out, we would be ruined. No one would talk to us. We would be pariahs. She looked at me with pleading eyes. She said, "Please, Kendall, you are the strong one. You always fix things. Do it for the family. Do it for me." I looked at her hands clutching mine. I remembered the coldness in her voice when she told Brielle to sell my grandmother's pearls. I remembered her telling me to park behind the shed. I remembered her telling me I was used to enduring. I gently pulled my hands away. I looked her in the eye. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the need to explain the years of neglect. I spoke softly. I said, "Mom, I spent my whole life begging you to see me. I stood right in front of you, and you looked through me to see Brielle. You looked through me to see Gavin." I pointed to the reflection in the dark glass of the terrace door. I said, "You didn't want a daughter. You wanted a reflection. You wanted something that made you look good." I said, "I asked to be seen. But you chose the mirror. You didn't choose me." I stepped back. I said, "The mirror is broken now, Mom, and I am not going to glue it back together for you. You have to live with the pieces." She stood there, her mouth open, the silence stretching between us like a canyon. She finally realized that the strong one wasn't a resource she could tap into anymore. I was a person, and I was gone. I turned away from her. I walked over to Earl. He was standing by the fireplace, watching me. He looked proud. He looked sad, but he looked proud. I told him the next steps. I was slipping into logistical mode, the only way I knew how to cope. I said Miles was outside. I said we had a lawyer meeting him at the station to ensure his statement was recorded correctly. I said we were going to freeze the accounts immediately to stop any automated transfers Gavin might have set up. I said, Grandpa, we are going to get that mortgage voided. We will prove fraud. You won't lose the house, but you might have to live in it alone for a while, or we can sell it. It's up to you. Earl put his hand on my shoulder. He squeezed it. He said he didn't care about the house. He said he had the only thing that mattered standing right in front of him. He asked if I was ready to go. I looked around the room one last time. I looked at the Christmas tree, the spilled champagne, the projection screen. It felt like a movie set for a film I never wanted to be in. I said, yes, get me out of here. We walked toward the front door. Miles was waiting there, holding the door open. He gave me a nod, a silent acknowledgement of a job done. I walked out into the night. The air was biting cold, sharp and clean. It scrubbed the smell of perfume and lies out of my lungs. Blue and red lights were still flashing in the driveway, casting long, strobing shadows on the snow. I saw the police cruiser pulling away with Gavin in the back. I saw another car waiting for Brielle. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. Revenge isn't sweet. That is a lie people tell. Revenge is heavy. It is exhausting. But as I stood there, watching the taillights fade into the darkness, I felt something else. I felt light. I felt the weight of the secrets, the weight of the liability, the weight of being the lesser sister fall off my shoulders. I reached out and took Earl's hand. His grip was firm. I wasn't the victim anymore. I wasn't the scapegoat. I wasn't the girl who parked behind the shed. I was the one who had burned the lie to the ground so the truth could breathe. We walked toward my Honda Civic, the cheap, dented car that I owned outright. I opened the door for my grandfather. We drove away from the mansion, down the long, winding driveway, leaving the ruins of the Graham dynasty in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. There was nothing there for me. The road ahead was dark, but my headlights cut through it, steady and bright. I was driving into a life that was finally completely mine. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you are tuning in from right now. Drop a comment below and let's chat. If you enjoyed seeing the truth come to light, please subscribe to Maya Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this story reach even more people. Stay safe, and remember, always read the fine print.